Well, speaking about old tricks and new tricks, we now turn to David Sabatini and something which is rather ominously called caloric restriction.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to take us down much closer to Earth here, and really on the feeding part of life. So I'm going to tell you in particular about a physiological state that's caused by something we call caloric restriction. This means basically willfully, if you're a human, or non-willfully, if you're a model organism, like a mouse, in which you lower the amount of calories that are taken in to some percentage of what one would normally consume if given free access to food. And of course, this is where most of us are normally, so ad lib eating. Normally, it's about a 30 to 40% reduction in caloric intake. And what happens to the animal is it'll quickly lose weight, get to a new steady state, and pretty much be able to sustain itself forevermore in that situation. So why do we care about this? Well, in many different systems, it's now been shown that caloric restriction, or CR, prolongs lifespan, including in mammals, really from unicellular to multicellular organisms. This is seeming really quite a true statement. And so we've been particularly interested in what is the biological basis of this? What are the molecular basis? What is the cellular basis of this? Now, there are humans that already do this. In fact, there's a society in which you can go to learn how to do caloric restriction. There's probably about 1,000 to 2,000 people that are practicing this. As you might imagine, this is extremely difficult to do. You have to measure all your calories every day, every single meal. So only certain particular people can do this. And so we're already starting to understand a little bit the pros and cons of this kind of practice. And there's certainly some cons to this. So for example, people report being cold most of the time. They report having low libido. And if that's not bad enough, they also report, and this is why I've taken this picture of Homer, they pretty much always think about food, continuously think about food. So that's okay, and nevertheless, it has this interesting effect on lifespan, and it pretty much doesn't sort of prolong just the last stages of life, much sort of a decrepit stage, but actually seems to retard the development of many, many different processes that we associate with aging across many, many different organ systems. So we've been interested in what's the basis of this, and so we focused in particular on what are called stem cells. These are cells that live in all our different organs and can give rise to really all the different cell types of a particular organ. In this case, this is a stem cell in the intestine called an LGR5 cell, and it can give rise to everything that's part of the intestinal lining. And what we find is that when you calorically restrict a mammal, in this case a mouse, the activity of this cell goes up. The numbers of it and its activity, it becomes better at doing what it normally does. And so this makes sense. If caloric restriction sort of makes tissues sort of age less well, you might imagine such a cell would be activated. So that's fine, and that's sort of it, and we're starting to understand the molecular basis of this. But we've also started to think, could this have a dark side to it? Not only just sort of libido, temperature, thinking about food. Because this type of cell, we now also appreciate, is usually the cell of origin of cancers. And so when mutations occur in this kind of cell, and then it becomes what we call transformed, as it acquires sort of cancer-like properties, and we call this process tumor initiation. This process in which that now transformed cell proliferates and makes an actual tumor, we call this tumor growth. So we started thinking, well, if this cell is activated, and there's more of them in a calorically restricted animal, it would stand to reason that if that animal underwent mutation, mutagens, there might be a greater chance that a cell would emerge here, a transformed cell. And so it might be that caloric restriction, we already know, retards the growth of tumors, but it actually might increase the numbers of tumors. Now, this surprisingly has never really been looked at, and part of the reason is that the way that we tend to do experiments, and this is really quite a few experiments, is we tend to put animals either on an ad libitum diet, mutagenize it, and then at some time point look at the tumors, count them, measure their size, look at whether they're high grade, low grade, or we put an animal in a calorically restricted state for its lifespan, mutagenize it genetically, chemically, and do this analysis. Now there's very few humans in this state. The vast majority of us do things like diet, calorically restrict, come off that diet, and live sort of the rest of our lives. And some of us even come off diets eating charbroiled steaks that are filled with sort of mutagens. And so this is actually the more relevant state to human beings. Very, very few people, maybe 1,000 do this. And we're starting to do this analysis, and unfortunately, it does seem that if you do this, calorically restrict, mutagenize, analyze, there actually are more tumors. So what's the solution to this? Well, you can remain calorically restricted always, so those tumors won't grow. Or you can avoid eating particular mutagens as you go from one state to another. And so, although relatively early, it really shows that there's probably the expression that having your cake and eating it too is probably quite adept here. We can get the rejuvenating effects of caloric restriction, but there'll be a downside to it in terms of what it actually do to, for example, tumor incidence. Thank you.
Well, when you described some of the effects of being calorically restricted, it reminded me of that old saying that you might not live longer, but it would feel like it.
Sure, exactly.
But you're actually saying that there is good evidence that caloric restriction does actually prolong real life and not just the appearance of it.
Sure.
And that then, if I understand you, we could do something else which might require even more moral discipline to avoid all the mutagens that would otherwise be disproportionately harmful to us. Is that right? So this requires a heroic level of self-discipline, is this right?
Exactly. So to be in this state is pretty much impossible. I've known people who've done caloric restriction, and it's an incredibly hard thing to actually do. And the thing that's happening now is we're starting to understand the molecular basis for this. So drugs are being developed that actually mimic this particular state. So there will be ways of perhaps of getting the benefits of caloric restriction without some of the pain of actually doing it. But the data we have, and I think some other people have data that's equivalent to this, really does suggest that every process that would depend on the activity of stem cells, like tumors, will also be increased by this action.
Right. And are there any practical applications of this work yet, or is that too early?
So I think the practical applications, as we get to some of these mimetics, and there's a molecule called rapamycin, which is quite a good mimetic of caloric restriction, we have to start thinking really about the long-term effects of using these molecules. Most experiments in mice and stuff are done in these 2-year periods in mice where, again, we put them in a state that no human really is able to do for their lifespan. So.
Right. Okay. Please, over here.
Hi. I wanted to ask, so you talked about caloric restriction and then moving to a normal eating cycle and consuming foods and stuff that have more mutagens. Well, I guess my question is, if you look at those two things offsetting each other at some point in time, do they completely offset each other? And at that point, and you're saying one of the things you could do is after you're on caloric restriction, avoid those foods. And I'm wondering if you've compared it to the situation where you just avoid those foods and don't do caloric restriction, and do you get at the end of some time period, do you get the same results? Or
sure. So I'm specifically talking about cancer here, of course. So caloric restriction actually seems to impact almost all organs. For example, the heart, for example, the immune system, muscle. So specifically here in cancer, that strategy might not work. I was being a little facetious about sort of avoiding sort of mutagens in that situation. If one stays on caloric restriction, it has remarkable anti-tumor growth properties. It really prevents tumors from growing. But the data is quite clear on the incidence, though, going up. And so that shift, which is, again, any of you who have dieted, me, any of us, that's what we do, right? We diet, we go back, we go these cycles. That's never been actually looked at in animals. We force them into something that we never actually do ourselves.
Okay. Please.
That was a great thought, thank you. So just out of curiosity, so CR causes tumorigenesis, like initiation. What's its effect on tumor progression? Now, cancer cells are highly metabolically active. So for the cancer to progress to a lethal phenotype, where does the caloric restriction come into play?
Yeah, so CR certainly, if you make a tumor model, it certainly slows the growth of that tumor. It won't stop it, but it'll certainly slow it down quite dramatically. But the numbers go up. And so, again, it's that switch from going from a CR state, pretty much everything is fine. But when you go to that ad lib state, now you have many more tumors that can all grow out.
So that looks like the worst of all worlds.
That's the worst of all worlds. What we do is the worst of all worlds, exactly.
Okay. Please.
I may be recalling incorrectly, but my recall is that the mouse studies were quite compelling. That one of the early primate studies was also compelling, but more recently, over the last year or so, the primate studies have been far less compelling. It's been hard to generalize the mouse studies up.
Yes, so you're certainly right. Some of the primate CR studies have not been as robust in sort of showing these sort of anti-aging effects. There are lots of issues with some of those studies and the numbers and how they were analyzed. They actually never completed lifespan studies in some of those studies. So there's lots of issues with them that the sort of CR community can point out. Probably too numerous to talk about now.
So be careful how you answer this. It's the mayor speaking. Please.
On TV last week, there was something about fasting, either alternate day fasting or other approaches to fasting, and I wonder where that fits into your research.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. So many times people do alternate days. So they eat one day, all they want, and then they fast, no food, and then so that's a bad one in my view, actually, because you're going through these boom-bust cycles quite a bit. The CR state really takes some time to get into. You really need, in animals and mice, you need a couple of weeks for the physiology to change and the organism to be different. You never do that.
So, thank you very much. Thank you.